Hey man, it's good to have you today. Anybody ready for the Word of God? Yeah. All right, let's jump into that. We're starting a new series this weekend that I am really pumped up about getting into and teaching. We got a cool little title about it. It is called Jesus Done Lost His Mind. Now, you can misinterpret that in a lot of different angles about that. There was a time where his own family thought he was mentally ill. They did. But when we talk about mental challenges, that's not what I mean by Jesus losing his mind. That's not the interpretation of that. You might remember when he turned the tables over in the temple, okay? And just turned them right over. And although it's not in the Bible, don't you think his disciples kind of stepped back and thought, the big guy is losing it, okay? But that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about emotional outbursts of blowing your stack. That's not what we mean by that. The religious leaders of his day thought he was lacking intellectual capacity. I mean, they thought that because they were among the most intellectual people in all of society, and Jesus didn't even go to their schools. But I want you to make sure you know this, that a low IQ is not what I mean by Jesus losing his mind. What we're going to talk about for a number of weeks here is what people thought of him, and make sure you catch this, what people's perspective of Jesus was after he explained what it meant to follow him. And when Jesus described his followers, his expectations were always way up here. And I have to believe that people would hear him describe, this is what it means to follow me. And he lists those up there, that people would hear that and think, bro, you have lost your mind if you think I'm doing that. Because the reality is that the expectations of Jesus for you and I is almost always higher than our own expectations. You might never have said that to Jesus out loud in prayer, but most of this room have probably thought that a time or two, is, man, I don't know if I can do that, God, because our standards aren't quite there. I remember counseling a couple a long time ago who were getting married, and I was going to do their ceremony, and they were just young kids. I remember thinking, you're too young to get married, and we were talking about their expectations for each other. And so he would say, this is what I want in a wife, this is what I don't want in a wife, and she would say, this is what I want in a husband, that's what I don't want in a husband. And so we were going through that. And so I was talking to the guy, and he was saying, here's what I want in a wife. And he looked at this young girl that he was going to marry, and he said, I'm going to be working all day, and so when I get home, I'd like dinner ready when I get there. And then he looked at her and said, and while you're getting the dishes done, I just need some space maybe to relax a little bit. And you saw her, you know what I mean when your eyebrows come to attention? And she looked at him and said, boy, you have lost your mind. Because his expectations were lower than hers. And that's exactly what I mean by this series, is that we're going to look at a period in the life of Jesus during a sermon that he taught, where he spent some time in that sermon saying, okay, if you want to follow me, now everybody kind of personalize that right now, that Jesus said, if you want to follow me, here's what it takes. And that sermon of his is the very first recorded sermon we have of Jesus. I think there's a reason for that. At the outset, he is saying, this is what I expect. And for about 30% of that sermon, which is a lot of a sermon, he jumped into that idea, and he talked about this idea of aspiring to spiritual greatness instead of settling for spiritual mediocrity. Now, we're going to kind of dive into that a little bit today, but I want you to kind of play with it just for a second as you look at that and do a self-evaluation for yourself and be honest about that. Are you okay with mediocrity when it comes to your spiritual life? Have you settled for that in any area where average is going to be okay for you? One year, my wife and I had been summoned to one of those dreaded parent-teacher conferences. So sorry if you're a teacher in the room. And we had to review the schoolwork of one of our kids. Now, I know some of y'all parents, you love that, okay? You eat it up because your kid is up here, And so my kid jumps out and bed, man, ready to go, and greatest grades and example of everything. We weren't that lucky. So our kids have grown up, they've done great, but when it came to school, here was their perception of school. Average is okay. Mediocrity is a blessing. That's kind of how they viewed school. So we show up at this teacher conference, and the teacher gets us around this table. Y'all been there, okay? And she leans over the table and she says, "Your son is a genius." And I said, "Excuse me?" "Your son is a genius." And remember, I bent over the table and I said, "Hastings." Her name's Hastings. Maybe you got the wrong file there. And she said, "No, you got to know what I mean by genius. I got the right kid." She said, "Your child has learned the exact line to get by. And with intentionality, he doesn't give any energy to get beyond that line at all. He's a genius with the line." See, I think that's us sometimes spiritually, where there's certain aspects of our life as followers of Christ where we kind of find the line that we're comfortable with. And what Jesus does is he goes above that. It says, no, this is what we shoot for. We shoot for greatness, not mediocrity. And so he brings that up in this famous sermon called the Sermon on the Mount, and he begins to present that idea in the very first chapter of that sermon. So I want you to see verse 20 of the 5th chapter of Matthew. It is known as the proposition of the whole sermon of Jesus. He said this, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness," so your spiritual lives, okay? I'm going to tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now let it be heavy with you. We all want to enter the kingdom of heaven. And what he says is, then you got to go way beyond Pharisees. And what Pharisees were they were the guys who were able to figure out the line. They knew the exact line, man. They knew exactly what the law said you could do, exactly what the law said you couldn't do. And man, they spent their whole time on the line. And Jesus said, man, I'm looking for people that go way past the line. I'm not looking for mediocrity. I'm looking for greatness. And as soon as he said that, he then in that sermon showed 6 illustrations of it. They were illustrations, just like I do in a sermon. He gave 6 illustrations of that. The first one was this. He said, now the Pharisees tell you, do not murder. And they were right. That was part of the law. That was the 7th of the 10 commandments. Do not murder. And that's what they said. Just live your life. Don't kill anybody. And Jesus said, but I tell you, go way past that. And don't even be angry at people. You see, what he was doing was he was saying, I'm looking for people who will strive for greatness spiritually. And then he did 5 more illustrations. And what I want you to play with today with me is the 6th one. The last illustration of this idea of we're not going to be mediocre, okay? We're not going to settle. We're going to aspire to greatness. And it came up with the idea of who you love in your life. Who do you love? And so Jesus talked about it, and I just want to read it for you. I want you to kind of hear it. I'm going to kind of think about what it might have been like for him to be teaching it and preaching it. And I just want you to hear it. He said, now you've heard. That was his way of saying, here's what the Pharisees were saying, okay? Here's the line. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. You've heard that. That's how you're living. Mediocre average. But I tell you, I want you to love your enemies. I want you to pray for those who persecute you, that you might be the sons of your Father in heaven, because he causes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. That's really important, this idea of sunshine and rain. Hang on to it, we'll come back later. He said, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get out of that? And are not even the tax collectors doing that? That's his way of saying everybody loves people who love them. He then went on and said, and if you greet only your brothers, you're nice only to the people that you know and like, what are you doing more than other people? Everybody does that. He said, I want you to be perfect, just like your heavenly Father is perfect. And so we've got this last powerful, crazy illustration about Jesus calls us to love enemies. Now, if you're there and you're hearing that for the first time, try to picture yourself back there in this Jesus guy's up here teaching this new thing, and you hear him say, I want you to love enemies. You're back shaking your head going, man, this cat done lost his mind. I believe, just my personal opinion, that this might be the single most difficult thing in the Bible that we're ever called to do. Love your enemy. It is the ultimate example of spiritual greatness. Because mediocrity says, I'm going to love my family, I'm going to love my friends. Greatness says, I'm going to love my enemy. Mediocrity says, I'm going to love the people that I like. Greatness says, I'm going to love the people that I don't like. Now, it's really easy to read the Bible and get that idea. That's clear. It's very simple what Jesus has said. But I'm going to ask you to go with me and say, come on, man. Really? I mean, how does a person really love somebody that they're divided with? And I don't care who you are, where you come from, what your story is. The vast majority of people in this room have had or have right now an enemy. Now, really, Jesus, come on. How do I love them? And so here's what I did with that. I just opened up that Bible and I looked at that text and I studied it as best I could. And I've come today with you to show you I think there are some hints in the text that I just read that give us an idea of Jesus saying, so here's how you can do this. And I want to show you those. They're almost hidden hints in the text that I read. And they come down to this. I want you to kind of see what I'm going to talk about. So how do I love an enemy? The passage I just read talks about, well, do good, want good, and look good. And if you can remember and master this, do good, want good, and look good, you will be a person who loves enemies. So let's talk about do good first. Now, you got to get down in the weeds with this for just a minute. So everybody kind of dial in. Okay, come on here with me and make sure that you don't miss this. When Jesus said to love our enemies, please make sure you hear this. His intention in the language that he used was that loving people was not a gushy, warm feeling. That to love somebody meant action. That you did something. Now, let me show you how that comes up in the weeds of the text. And everybody just kind of stay with me. I'll do this as quick as I can. Many of you know, because you go to East Side, and we're smart, right? Okay, so there's 4 of us that are smart. The rest of you, I don't know about you. So we know that the story of the life of Jesus is told 4 times in the Bible by 4 different guys. We know that here. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. They're called the Gospels of Jesus in the Bible. And so while they're telling about his life, there are often times where an event or maybe a lesson of Jesus is told by more than just one of those guys. In fact, next Easter in springtime, I'm going to do a series. I can't wait for it, man. I've looked forward to doing it for a long time. And it is the events in the life of Jesus that all 4 guys wrote about. And say, man, that'll be really important. All 4 of them mention it. For the most part, there were times when Jesus said something or he did something that maybe a couple of the guys wrote about, or maybe 3 of the guys wrote about. So this idea where Jesus said, okay, I want you to excel, man, greatness. I want you to love enemies. It was told by 2 of the guys. Matthew is one of them, and Luke was the other one. And when they told it, it was a little different how they wrote it. Let me show you what I mean. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, this is the text that we read earlier. Jesus simply said, love your enemies. Now, when Luke wrote about that exact lesson, Luke said, Jesus is quoted as saying, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Do you see what Luke did was he then defined what it meant to love somebody. It's not a gushy, warm feeling. It is that I'm doing good things as a sign of my love. Now, why did Matthew not mention it and Luke did? Well, Luke told us early in his writing, he said, I'm going to be more thorough than anybody. I'm going to be more detailed than anybody who's ever written about Jesus. And so Luke gives us more information. So we know right out of the gate here, that when Jesus said love enemies, and you and I are like, come on, how do you do that? What he was saying is I'm talking about doing good to them, doing good for them. Now, we know that scribes, years and years later, this is a detail, hang with me, years and years later, when scribes would copy the Gospels, that there was a scribe who was copying Matthew's gospel, and he said, love your enemy. And for that scribe, apparently, he wanted some more than just that. And so he went to Luke's version, and he added it, put it in Matthew's version. So you might have a Bible that quotes that in Matthew because a scribe understood it, that doing good to somebody else is an example, an illustration of what loving them means. Now, Matthew didn't write that. What Matthew did was, before he got into this idea of loving enemy, right before it, as he's talking about this excelling, he said this. Look at this verse. You may have seen this before. He said, now if somebody forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Now, what in the world is that talking about? Well, in that culture, the Roman government had the authority to just pull somebody from the community and say, here, you got to do this for me right now. Remember when they grabbed that guy and told him to carry the cross of Jesus? They had the authority to do that. So a Roman authority could be just walking around carrying a box and grab you and say, I'm taking that box a mile. You got to go with me. And Jesus said, now if they ever do that to you, say, yes, sir. I'll walk 2 miles if you want. And so even Matthew is highlighting this idea that these are the expectations of Jesus, that you do good to your enemy. Now stop right there. Let's just get real for a second. So some of you are with me and you know this lesson, you got into this when I started. You're thinking right now, bro, I don't know if I can do that. I don't know, man. You don't know my story. You know what I've been through. I don't know if I can do that. Jesus done lost his mind. Instead of thinking that what he's asking you to do is to feel gushy, warm feelings, he's not saying that. He's saying, just choose to do something good and watch what will happen. One of my most favorite stories in all of my preaching, I get asked that a lot because I love to tell stories. And people will ask me sometimes, what's your favorite story to tell? And someday I think I might write those down before I hang the cleats up. I think I might write them all down. But I would say on the top 5 is a story that I think I've told that many, many times here, but it just fits so well here. It's one of my favorite stories ever, and apparently it's true. Written by this mom, I believe in Kansas is where she was from. And this mom had taken her daughter to lunch one day. And she had a little daughter, I think maybe 6 or 7, something like that. And they were having lunch, and it came time for them to eat. And she'd asked the little girl to pray for the food. And so she thanked Jesus for the food. They got a cute little girl. And she ended her prayer by saying, "And Jesus, tell my mom to get me some ice cream for dessert." And she said, "Amen." And they both kind of chuckled about it and thought it was kind of cute. And there was an elderly lady sitting at a table next to them who'd been hearing the whole thing. And when the little girl said amen, this older lady kind of took offense at that. And she was kind of, snooty old lady like this, and, just kind of got blue hair sticking straight. You know what I'm talking about. And so she said, "Well, I never. That's what's wrong with America. Kids asking for ice cream for Pete's sake." And this old girl heard her. And she started getting teary-eyed. She asked her mom, "Did I pray wrong? Did I say something wrong?" And the mom said, "No, you didn't say anything wrong at all. Nothing wrong at all." And then the mom felt, "I'm going to get this girl some ice cream, no matter what that old lady thinks." And she orders her some ice cream, and she's picking at the ice cream. And while she's picking at it, an old fella walks by, and he'd been watching the whole thing. And he bent down to that little girl, and he said, "Honey, I happen to know that God thought that was a great prayer." And she said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "For me to tell you that ice cream is good for the soul." And the old man walked away. The mom wrote the story, and she said when the old man walked away, that her daughter, without any prompting at all, got up out of her chair, and she took her ice cream over to Miss Blue Hair, and she put it on her table and said, "Here, this is for you. Ice cream is good for the soul, and my soul is already good." Now, here's what I love about that, is that when you think about that story, you might need to give some ice cream to somebody without the snide comment, okay, at the end. And Jesus said, that's what it means to love. So Dave, how can I do that? Well, start thinking about doing good. Now, once you do good, then Jesus then moves in, and if you dive down into it, you see another hint, which I've called want good. And Matthew did define what he meant by loving the enemy, not by doing good, but Matthew adds this idea, and pray for them. So not only do good to them, but pray for them, to ask God to be a blessing and a favor in their life. And you can hear that right now, and you can think, okay, that's the Christian thing to do, and so I'll pray for them, God be with them, blah, 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 and I'll just kind of remotely get through that. But I want you to hear something. I want you to hear something about intentional, purposeful prayer. Everybody come here. I want you to look at this. The power of prayer is not in what you receive, but in who you become. You see that? That real prayer is not that God answers what you want him to give you. Real prayer is what God does in your life while you pray to him. Now, that is a key part of this text in figuring out how in the world am I going to love my enemy? How are we going to do that? Well, over time, if you are a prayer person, you will learn that when you ask God for things with great intentionality, and I know some of your stories out here where you've had times in your life where you were pleading with him to show up with something. And those of you who've been there will know that what happens on the end of that is not whether or not God gave you what you asked for. At the end of that is what God did in your heart through that process. Now, I had mentioned that our leaders had our day of fasting and prayer circles a couple weeks ago. And so because of that, I had spent that day praying more than I normally would pray. I wasn't eating that day, and so those times of dinner and eating and other times of the day, I would just stop and I would pray because it was an unusual day of prayer. And we'd ask our leaders to pray very specifically. Pray that our congregation would receive the vision. Pray right now that God would prepare the lives of people to be here on Saturday night and meet his son. Pray that all of us would catch the vision to where we would be financially generous for the work of God to make it happen. And so we were all praying for those things. All of us were pleading with God, would you provide that? And throughout the day, I and others would just walk around this campus throughout this day, just praying, God, would you do that? Would you do that? Would you do that? Would you do that? And I noticed toward the end of the night, probably around dinner time, that when I would stop and pray and get in my own little closet somewhere and spend a couple of minutes, I noticed that toward the end of the night, I wasn't asking God for any of those things. They had seemingly kind of disappeared from my psyche. And I found myself in those times of prayer that it wasn't about what I want God to give to me. It was God working in my heart, and I was responding to what he wanted me to give him. Is there anybody in the room that knows what I'm talking about? And so Jesus brings this concept in your relationship to your enemies, to pray for them. And I want to intend to show you that what will happen when you pray for them and you ask them, God, would you do this for them? Would you do this for them? Would you do that for them? The reality is when you're doing that for your enemy at the beginning, you probably don't even mean it. You don't even want it. You're doing it out of obedience. Do this for their life. And you will find yourself after times of intentionality that instead of asking God for that, God is then working in your life. I wrote this on my Facebook page that night. I hope some of you are able to see it. I brought it here. I said, I've noticed during times of spiritual fasting that toward the end of the fast, the things I've been asking God for become less and less important, and wanting more of him becomes the focus of my heart. And so I think that's why Jesus brought this. I think it's a hint. How do I love my enemy, Lord? I'm okay with right here, okay? How do I love him? Jesus said, you start praying for him. You start praying for good things to happen in their life. Well, I don't know about that. Well, just start praying it. And you just start praying for whatever those things are. Keep them healthy, help them here, do that for them. And you're just doing all that stuff. And over time, you start to see something change in you. I'm telling you, it happens, and you'll never know until you do it. And you find yourself toward the end of all that wanting good things for them, wanting it. I remember a guy that happened to him. He'd been hurt at work by another person in an unthinkable way. In fact, the offense that had come upon this guy was of legal matter, incredible hurt. And this man had come to me and asked me as a pastor, will you help me work through that? And so we were spending time on a pastoral level just trying to help him deal with the fact of what this guy did for him. And we were in this process of learning to pray for him, which took a long time for him to say, okay, I'll do that. And he was starting to pray for him. And I remember during the prayer process, I remember 2 phone calls that he gave me. This is 25 years ago. I still remember the phone calls. One phone call he gave me, it was so unusual, I remember what I was doing. I was painting a bedroom in our house, and the phone rang, it was him. I said, hey man, what's going on? He goes, I made a decision. I made a great decision. I said, what is it? What is it? He goes, I have decided that I'm not gonna kill him with a chainsaw. That's exactly what he said. And I said, okie dokie, baby, we're rolling. So now maybe the next thing. And he said, I'm not trying to be funny. I have decided that. God's worked in my heart. That's not the answer. I said, good. Okay, we're going in the right direction. And over time, the second time he called me back, I remember him saying, he said, there's times when the scuttlebutt, the gossip at work is that somebody's going to get fired or somebody's getting laid off. And he said, Pastor, whenever I've heard that scuttlebutt for years, whenever I've heard that, my very first reaction was, God, I hope it's him. I hope they're getting rid of him. And he said, I've been praying for good things in his life. And he said last week there was kind of a notice out that there were some people who were going to be promoted to another level at our work. And he said, without any purposeful reason at all, my very first thought was, I hope it's him. And what happened is that God changed him through prayer. And so I want you to take that out of here. I want you to see that Jesus said, man, I want you to surpass mediocrity. And loving enemy is an example of that. And here's the way you can do that, is you can just pray goodness over them and watch how that will change your life to want good for that person. Now, there's a final kind of hint that I think is kind of the cherry on the top of the whole thing. And I've called it look good. So do good, okay? Want good, which is a result of praying. And then I want you to look good, Jesus said. I want you to look good. Now, this is the point of the text. And everybody hang on this. Of everything I've said so far, I don't know how long I've been preaching. Some of y'all know because you keep track of that. But I've not got to the real point yet, because the whole point is what I'm about to say. That Jesus taught them that if you can love an enemy, if you can do this, if you can surpass it, okay? If you can get there, then Jesus said this, you will look like me. Because that's what I do. You remember the sun and rain thing? And he threw that right in the middle, and you might be reading that and thought, what in the world does that have to do with loving enemies? And what he was saying is that God gives sun and rain to everybody, good people, bad people, and in an agricultural context in which they lived, they needed sun and rain for crops. And Jesus said, my Father just gives it to everybody, whether you're a good person or a bad person, whether you do right things or wrong things. He does good to everybody. And so when you do good, when you love enemies, watch this, you look like him. Doesn't that sound like our mission here? Doesn't that sound like our purpose as a church? That we can convince more and more and more people to conform, mold, change their lives into what? The likeness of Jesus. That we look like him, we sound like him, we talk like him, we think like him. And that's what he did in this text, is that you end up by loving enemies. Watch this. You end up, when you do that, making him look good. That's why we love enemies. Now I want to tell you something that happened in my life within the last week. I forget what day it was. And it kind of hit me about how powerful this is. Susan and I went for breakfast one morning. And that's my favorite meal of the day. I love breakfast more than anything. I have a great breakfast. I don't need to eat the rest of the day. I love breakfast. And she doesn't like breakfast. But she goes, opportunity to hang out with me. I mean, she's there. That's how I take it anyway. So I might be misreading that. So we're having breakfast. And we're sitting there. And our server comes over. And she's one of those, really outgoing, aggressive, talkative ladies. And she just, in our face, and we're going along with it and talking with her and blah, blah, blah. And somewhere in the middle of all that, Christmas came up. And Susan had asked her, because they kind of had a thing going, and Susan asked her, what do you want for Christmas? And she said, within a split second, she said, I want a crock pot. And I said, a crock pot? Why do you want a crock pot for Christmas? And we were all cracking up about it. And then she said, well, I've got cancer. You know, and then you feel about this tall. She goes, I got cancer. I'm dealing with cancer. She goes, I got 3 kids. I'm a single mom. And one of the kids needs brain surgery. And you were just like, oh my gosh. And she's just throwing all this stuff out. And she said, the idea of throwing something in the crock pot and getting home at night after I'm dog tired from 2 jobs and the food's ready kind of sounds good. That's why I want a crock pot. And she was being sarcastic and funny about it. And so we just kind of laughed about all that. So we ate and we paid our bill and we were getting in the car, we're heading home, and getting in the car, and Susan said, turn right, head over there to Target. And I said, baby, I don't want to go to Target. I don't want to go to that cash trap. I got things to do. What am I going to Target for? She said, I've learned in my life, guys, let me help you, okay? I'm going to change your life. Men, women, just tone me out, okay? Which you already have. Men, don't ever get in the way of a woman hell-bent on going to Target, okay? Just don't mess with it. So she said, turn right, we're going to go to Target. I said, why are we going to go to Target? She said, I'm going to get her a crock pot. I said, you're going to what? We're going to get her a crock pot. And so pull over to Target, and Susan gets out, and she goes and buys a crock pot. She comes back in the car, and we go back to the restaurant. She takes it in there and gives it to the girl. And she comes back and gets in the car, and we go home. And I can't get it out of my head all day. And I'm mowing my yard that day, and I'm thinking about how proud I am of my wife. Because I don't see those things. I don't notice them. And I'm so proud of her, and I got to thinking about how proud God was of her. Because that's a good thing to love people like that. That is a great thing. And I think that my heart was small compared to what God's heart must have been. And then I thought more about that, and I can see God saying that was a great job, Susan. And I can see God saying that brought a tear to my eye, and the world would be a better place if there were more people who did things like that. And I'm thinking all that while I'm mowing. And then I studied this sermon, and I wrote this sermon. And I wonder if God would follow it up with this. But I got a quick question. Would you have bought the crock pot if your food was cold? Would you have bought the crock pot if your order was wrong, or if your server was in a bad mood, or if your check was overcharged? Would you have bought the crock pot if she was a different skin color than you? Would you have brought the crock pot if she was voting for the person that you're not going to vote for? Would you have bought the crock pot if she'd hurt your kids? Would you have brought the crock pot if she'd stolen money for you? Would you have brought the crock pot if she lied about you to somebody else? See, loving people, loving your neighbor, folks who are kind to you, that is awesome. But loving your enemy? Now, bro, that's greatness. And when you can do that, you reflect the beauty of a God that this old broken world desperately, desperately needs. So don't settle for mediocrity. Bath through it. Love your enemy. Now I want you to do something with me. Everybody stand. Everybody stay right here. So when we head out here in a minute, if you're one of our guests, we got some stuff for you. Go get it, okay? And remember, bring your boxes back. If you haven't given your offering, there's boxes on the back. Take care of that. But you remember what we talked about last week? Remember that? We're going to do go on 3. And it isn't any more applicable than right now. Because we gathered here. You did awesome. You came to the gathering. You know what we've done in the last 40 minutes? We've grown in our understanding of God, what he wants. And now it's time to go. Go do it. So team, get our hands up. Go on 3. 1, 2, 3. Go! Have a great week.